The story of Beowulf is one of many contradictions and one of many examples of synthesis. The work itself is the oldest work or oldest written work in English, older English actually. The original language that it's in is very something that would be very, very different than what we have right now. The truth of the matter is, the translation we have is very, very palpable compared to what the original language sounds like. It is a form of English, but that Middle English was much more difficult to actually understand in contemporary times. And so this really kind of highlights a few of the things that we're going to talk about throughout the semester. Uh, Beowulf itself deals with the hero and the monster dichotomy. Uh, Beowulf, his heroic ideals are really based off of how violent he could be. The more violent he was, the more heroic he was. And so, what you'll see throughout the story is that elements of the hero are really all about them boasting about themselves. They're trying to build themselves up, and they'll consistently retell their story again and again and again. And so, what you'll see in Beowulf, you'll see Beowulf arrive at the beachhead, and you'll see the guy from the tower come down to actually greet him, and Beowulf will start to tell him who he is, so on and so forth. And then later on, you'll see him kind of introduce himself again to the king, King Hrothgar. And then once again, later on in the story, once Beowulf has defeated Grendel and Grendel's mother and whatnot, and they're having this celebration, King Hrothgar is celebrating, there at Harrowit Hall and whatnot, which, by the way, Harrowit Hall is all about the idea of Hart Hall. Hart is a deer, and so Harrowit Hall itself is full of trophies. Full of trophies. There's antlers everywhere, so on and so forth, so that when the hunter hunted, so on and so forth, they put them up there. And so the hall itself is about boasting once again. And so when Beowulf goes, they're having this party after he's defeated Grendel and Grendel's mother. King Hrothgar throws him this party, and he has one of his singers, one of his poets, come up and tell the story of Beowulf. So once again, you see that retelling of the story. Now, this is indicative of something that was happening contextually in history throughout Britain at that particular point in time. Most people were uneducated, which means that most people were illiterate. They couldn't read, okay? And by far, the oral tradition was something that was prevalent in society. It's the way that they told their stories from generation to generation to generation to generation, so that they wouldn't get lost. Now, what you see in the retelling of Beowulf's story, the story itself, you see vestigial elements of the oral tradition embedded in the work itself, which basically means, vestigial means it's something that's, it's a remnant from the past that's no longer needed, like your appendix. At one point we did need it because our foodstuffs required extra bile, so on and so forth, and that appendix, that little appendage, was needed so we could digest things properly. At this point, in the industrialized modern world, we don't need that anymore. Our food's more processed, we don't eat as much roughage. And so the fact that we have an appendix, it's a sign that, we used to need it, now we don't, it's still here. The repetition of Beowulf's story in the work itself is vestigial. It's not needed anymore. And the point I'm making here is the idea that during this particular time, there was a shift. There was a shift going from the oral tradition to the written tradition. The oral tradition, the way that people remembered stories was by word of mouth. They tell stories, and then they tell the next generation, and then they tell the next generation, and then they tell the next generation. Now, in order for these stories to be remembered better, there was a few things that happened. First of all, there was exaggeration. So when you're reading Beowulf, you're going to read an exaggeration of the monsters that he defeats. He's going to be talking about a race. There's one particular scene where he's talking with Unferth. And Unferth is King Hrothgar's right-hand man. And Unferth, he loves being the king's right-hand man. But when Beowulf comes in, Beowulf, he's this big, strong warrior like no other. When Beowulf comes in, King Hrothgar almost immediately has a bromance with him. He falls in love with Beowulf like that. Unferth gets jealous, and so Unferth calls Beowulf out. Says, "Oh, aren't you the Beowulf that had that race with Brecca that one time? You swam across the sea. He bested you. He won. how can you expect to come into this kingdom and defeat Grendel if you can't even win a race? And so what Beowulf does is he calls him out. He said, well, in the race, what you don't know is that I was pulled under by a sea monster. And then as soon as I killed that one, then there was another sea monster. And as soon as I killed that one, there was another sea monster. And eventually I killed 7 sea monsters, and I made the seas safe for everyone to sail, so on and so forth. Well, the truth of the matter is, if there was an actual Beowulf in history, there were no sea monsters that he was actually killing. You know, there wasn't a Grendel-type monster who had scaly skin. There wasn't a dragon, you know, like it is at the end of Beowulf that he fought. These are all exaggerations to build up the heroic ideals of what Beowulf represents. Now, exaggeration is part of the oral tradition, and it's because the more you exaggerate, the easier it is to remember it. And so these stories from generation to generation to generation to generation would change. They would change. Another element of oral tradition is the idea of change. Every time you tell the story, even if it's yourself, if you tell the story, a specific story, from one time to the next time to the next time, it changes. If you're telling a story to a group of children, you're telling it a certain way. If you're telling it to a group of adults, you're saying it a certain way. If you're doing it, if you're telling a literary story to a room full of teachers, you're telling it a different way. Okay, and so there's that aspect of the oral tradition, you know, where the audience actually plays a part in the narrative itself in terms of how they have to react, so on and so forth. The other thing is, imagine a room full of 30 people. Imagine that you all were sitting here with me, and we were just talking, and I whispered Kwame Nutri into one of y'all's ears, and then I tell that person to whisper to the next person, and whisper to the next person, and whisper to the next person, so it comes full circle around, and we'll have something completely different. Okay, this element of storytelling has allowed stories to change, you know, from generation to generation to generation. Beowulf, when you see that retelling, what that is, that's a contextual element of what was happening in history at that time. The reason it's repeated over and over and over again, why Beowulf's tale is told over and over again, it's because of the oral tradition. Beowulf at one point was told by mouth, by word, and then somebody decided to write it down. And once it got written down, that's that shift from the oral tradition to the written tradition. Now, the written tradition is a little bit bad as well in terms of stories. And the way I can kind of explain this is, when Beowulf was written, it was written in a specific language, okay, the Middle English that it's actually written in. Actually, the older English that it's written in. Once it got translated over to the version that we have now, some of the things get lost in translation. This is one of the best ways, one of the best examples that I can kind of actually explain to you in terms of the written tradition and how it changes in translation is the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language itself has 22 letters in its alphabet, as opposed to the English alphabet, which has 26. Now, the thing is, English is a phonetic language, meaning that it captures sound, so on and so forth. It's not an ideogrammic language like Cantonese that has little drawings which actually represent, you know, pictures of something. Hebrew has an alphabet of 22 letters, and each one of those letters actually has a numerical value, so that when you put together a word, that particular word in terms of numerology, you can add up the numerical values of it, and it'll give you a number. Okay, and these numbers have significance in the Hebrew beliefs. There's something that's really, really fascinating about the Hebrew language as well. There's certain words where if you add the numerical value of all of them together, they form the same numerical value of a collective word. So, for example, if you said, and this isn't exactly right, but it's in there, and you can find it. You can find it if you go and do your research and whatnot. And I don't know the exact numerical components, and I don't remember the exact words, but it happens. Okay, imagine that you have the word father, the word mother, and the word child. If you add all of them up and you get the numerical value of those 3 words, and then you get the word family and you get the numerical value of that particular word, they are actually the same. And so when you translate Hebrew from Hebrew to a different language, there's all sorts of ins and outs that are being lost in translation. And so one thing that you have to understand is that what you're reading in terms of Beowulf is not the original text, and that makes a difference. That absolutely makes a difference. Now, oral versus written, there are certain things about both of them that have their strengths and weaknesses. Beowulf has both. Okay, Beowulf has elements of the written tradition, elements of the oral tradition. All right, now the movement, the shift from the oral tradition to the written tradition, from going from a story that changes by word of mouth to a story that's actually written down. What I can kind of show you, or what I can make you understand, is that if I were to write out quad menu treatment is 3, and then showed it to one of y'all, and then it went from person to person, you showed it to the next person, you showed it to the next person, so on and so forth. At the end, it would be the same. And so the written tradition has a little bit more permanence. However, like I said, that translation is a problem. It is absolutely problematic. Now, during the times of Beowulf, on top of this, what I'll describe as a rising consciousness, and I do want you to understand the shifts that we're going to be talking about as a rise in consciousness. Literature itself is a way to measure rises in consciousness. It's a person who's experiencing something and they understand the world in a completely new way. They write it down, and for that moment in time, there's a snapshot of the social consciousness. Okay, and it's a rise in consciousness. It's a shift in consciousness. Going from the oral tradition to the written tradition, it's a shift. Okay, now during this particular time, there were other things that were happening. Primarily, there was the spread of Christianity. Beowulf is primarily a paganistic story. Paganism is not necessarily evil. Paganism is just the idea of worshiping nature, like the Greek gods, the god of thunder, the god of lightning, the god of the sun. The sun god is actually a really big one across all cultures, so on and so forth. Paganism is just the idea that nature is being worshipped, and so it's not necessarily evil. Yes, witchcraft has paganistic elements in it, but not all pagans are witches. Okay, and so at this time, the spread of Christianity was trying to take hold, so on and so forth. And what you see in Beowulf is you see some of those elements in the context. You see some of the men, whenever the failures are starting to happen, whenever there's, how can I say this? Whenever things aren't going great, what you see is that you see some of those men actually leave the camp and go back to caves to practice their previous paganistic rituals, because at that point they're losing faith in the spread of new religions, so on and so forth. And so that battle is happening as well, the pagans versus the Christians. And at this point in time, for Beowulf, by far there's more pagans there. By far it's a very paganistic and kind of nature-based story. And so, there's competing elements that are going on in there. And so what I want you to do for this particular discussion is I want you to identify elements of the oral tradition and elements of the written tradition, because they're both in Beowulf. And what I want you to do is I want you to write me a statement. Well, first of all, I want you to find, text, put it in there, explain it and interpret it for me. At least 2 quotes from the text. One that shows the oral tradition, and then the second one to show the written tradition. Okay? And then I want you to tie those 2 together using the concept of Hegelian synthesis, or sublime writing, or dialectics, to show that these competing elements of polemic value are a way to show a rise in consciousness.